So thank you, Nanaba, and thank you, Holly, for inviting me. And thank you to all of the organizers. This has been a very thought-provoking and extremely well-organized conference, and it's a real joy to be involved. So today I'm going to be talking about the ethics of research on autism and environmental factors, and this really dovetails with many topics that we've heard throughout the last day and a half, and I'll give you a sense of where we're heading. So I'm going to talk about this move from sort of a sense of cause to a proliferation of research on risks and the kind of culture that that produces around individuals' sort of perceptions of autism, especially in relationship to risk factors. I'm going to talk about environmental risk research specifically, how this is presented in the news, which, as we've heard, is quite influential in how people interact with this kind of information, and why this is happening now. So from a sociological perspective, what we're seeing and why it's happening, what its connections are to a larger field of biomedical research, and especially its emphasis on early life. And here I'm going to focus on what kinds of implications environmental research in particular holds when it comes to focus in and around pregnancy. And this is a big focus of this type of research. And then I'm going to draw on interviews that I've conducted and discuss the ethical and social implications related to these. So as we've heard from Steve Silberman yesterday and from Michael Udell today, we've seen this shift from sort of a monolithic or single cause idea of autism to this move to understand risk factors associated with autisms. And this multiple understanding of autism travels in the biomedical arena as well. So researchers have really moved into understanding multiple factors that might be associated with the development of autism, how those progress over the life course, but in particular have moved away from sort of a single notion of what causes autism. This comes hand in hand with our understanding, based on experiences, that there is no single autism. There are multiple autisms. And relatedly, there's no single cause for autism, but researchers have shown that there are many genetic and environmental risk factors associated with the development of autism. This interest in this sort of multiplex, complex understanding of development in general has been growing not only within autism research, but in relationship to complex conditions more broadly. And so this interest in how environmental factors interact with our genes to shape development over the life course has really gained attention not only in relationship to autism, but more broadly as well. So what does this mean for autism? Well, there's been an increasing number of studies related to environmental factors since the early 2000s. And interestingly, although there's been this sort of explosion of research since that moment, there were studies in the early 70s that showed relationships between rubella infection and exposure to thalidomide and incidence of autism cases when those exposures or infections happen during pregnancy. And so this sort of long dormant question about the relationships between environmental risk factors, especially during pregnancy, and the development of autism has become more popular recently. And a sort of bookend to this is that in 2016, just several months ago, at the International Meeting for Autism Research, one of the keynote addresses and panels was titled "Pushing the Boundaries for Understanding Environmental Influences for Neurodevelopment." And interestingly enough, though this was sort of meant to encapsulate a larger field that is getting more attention, that Pushing the Boundaries panel actually got some pushback as well. And that's because the framing of environmental risks, as we heard earlier in Michael Udell's talk, has implications for how we understand autism more broadly. And the language of risk tends to present a problem that we're anticipating and potentially shape our understandings of what the politics of that kind of information might be. And so that presentation was seen differently from different stakeholder perspectives, and it raises important issues about which I'll discuss in the future slides. Now, what are we talking about when we talk about environment? Now, we've heard in the media an extensive amount of coverage about vaccines and the vaccine concerns, controversies, and books written by parents and individuals. But what researchers are really focused on is not vaccines. They've moved away from that question in part because there's no scientific evidence to support that hypothesis, and moved towards a broad understanding of environmental factors that include endogenous and exogenous factors. So these are factors that occur in the body and external to the body. And interestingly enough, this very significant field of research is broad in its application. So many researchers that I spoke with defined environment as anything that was not genetic. So this obviously includes a wide array of factors and are not very well defined in the literature. But these include toxicological, medical, physiological, and to very little degree sociological factors. And we heard about the impact that social classification changes and understandings of autism diagnosis have had in terms of who is diagnosed with autism, but these are very rarely investigated by researchers doing environmental risk research. They're much more focused on biological pathways, etiology, and the like. And as other researchers mentioned, there's really this interest not in an exclusive research agenda about environment per se, but actually looking at the interactions between environmental factors and genetics. But the one place where this appears probably most clearly is in the media, where all of these nuances about how we define the environment, what it means, and what its social and ethical implications are often encapsulated in quite provocative headlines. And you see on the slide, study reinforces link between autism and pesticides, air pollution may put kids at great risk for autism, and this highlighted a headline from just several weeks ago, Tylenol may increase risk of autism in children if taken during pregnancy. And again, this sort of wide variety of risk factors that are being reported, and these very direct sort of statements about the implications these have for autism risk, when in fact these studies have very relatively low risk ratios and impacts on our overall understanding of autism. So when both parents' ages are linked to autism risk, or one of my favorites, the womb is being presented as environment, how are people to perceive this information, and how is it affecting autistic individuals, their families, scientists, and policymakers? Well, there's been a pushback against this kind of alarmist rhetoric and the kinds of headlines that are taking place on this slide. And science writers and social scientists, bioethicists, and many others, and self-advocates as well, have really pushed back to say, beware of this freak out, right? That these results need to be contextualized, that the headlines that you see in the news are really incomplete information that may be fear-mongering and may also lead to really negative perceptions of autism that are imbalanced with our understanding of how people live their lives on the spectrum. So why is this happening now, right? Well, this is a very simplified diagram of a much more complex social and historical process, but I just want to give you a sense of the sort of intersecting ways in which the current moment has shaped the kinds of research priorities that we see. And we've heard from Paul Shattuck and Liz Pelicano that those priorities are very much emphasizing biologic and etiologic risk factors and causes, and not services and lifespan issues. So where did this emphasis come from? Well, we have to accept that in United States, we operate on a medical model very significantly in terms of our funding streams, and that the social model of disability that's been mentioned several times during this conference is really not represented in our funding priorities to the extent that it would be helpful for people's lives. So when you see this rising awareness of autism that's happened over the last several decades, some scientists, advocates, physicians, and parents have pushed for biological research research to better understand autism, to understand many of the factors that Holly spoke to in her presentation that have meaning for them for various different reasons, but also to better understand what's happening on a biologic level, because that is a priority that has been set culturally by our country. There's a recognition in the biomedical community that genes alone do not explain autism, that we're dealing with multiple autisms and very complex interactions between genes and gene-environment interactions that might shape development more generally, and particularly in relationship to neurodevelopment. And as a result of sort of this trajectory, there's been increased funding, pressure on policymakers to allocate resources to investigate environmental risk factors related to autism. At the same moment in time when this increased pressure is taking place and an incomplete understanding of autism is being better recognized, there's been epidemiologic research for a longer period of time that have really shown that environmental factors may have unique effects during early development. And this is not particular to autism, but it's become an area of interest for researchers because of the implications for brain development and neurodiversity more broadly. Well, this emphasis on early life is actually quite consequential when we think about the ethics and social implications of environmental research in particular. And this is because not all, but a very large section of research on environmental factors in autism has focused around or before pregnancy. So you see these images on the screen of how the first 9 months shape your life. This image from a op-ed in the New York Times of a woman's body as plants and flowers with a human fetus nestled in her womb. And then this image, which is interesting in terms of balancing maybe the gendered dimensions of responsibility that you see in a lot of headlines between a mother who's pregnant and a father who has quite a bit of a belly as well. So the effects of environmental factors have really indicated that multiple different exposures or experiences may impact autism risk. And these have low effects, but nevertheless have circulated very widely and impact people's perceptions of autism. So studies indicate that pollution, chemical exposures, diet, medication, age, and infection may all increase autism risk. And these are really focused around in utero processes, so processes that take place during fetal development, really putting a lot of emphasis on eggs and sperm, but also very particularly emphasizing parents' exposures, experiences, and decisions in ways that in our culture where we really have a focus around pregnancy and pregnancy health really can come to impact women in particular. So why does this matter? Well, we heard some of these points raised in earlier talks, but I just want to emphasize that from researcher perspectives, they have intentions that are not meant to be provocative in a negative way. They mean to enhance our understandings of autism. They see environmental research in particular as maybe providing possibilities for individual, social, or regulatory action around factors that have been pervasive in our environment, including pollution or other factors that we know to be detrimental to health more broadly, and are using autism as sort of a vehicle to think about these more holistically. And in the best of scenarios, perhaps this type of research might provide a model for thinking about health and development in a much more complex way, right? As opposed to thinking about genes, environments as separate, thinking about a holistic way of understanding development as a trajectory that unfolds in a culture and a society where we have some ability to make choices about what we find acceptable in terms of risks. However, and this is what I'll focus on for the remainder of the talk, there's ethical challenges associated with environmental risk research in particular. And these include the ability of this narrative around risk in particular to reinforce blame and stigma. It has implications for disability rights and autism acceptance. The framing around autism as a problem that becomes sort of embedded in risk language is very problematic. And association is not causation. So in the headlines that you saw in previous slides, it raises alarm that living next to a freeway, perhaps, may produce a higher risk of autism when individuals may not have the opportunity to change those environments individually. And it can lead to risk factor fatigue in terms of people's misunderstandings of that information. So my research is really focused broadly on this phenomenon of environmental factor research. Where did it come from? How did it develop? And it included interviews with researchers, policymakers, and parents, including observations at conferences and of the research itself. And I want to turn to parent interviews in particular because I think they provide important perspectives about what the stakes of these issues really are, what the stakes of this research are in the lived experiences of especially mothers of children on the autism spectrum. So this next few slides draws on 25 interviews with mothers that lasted from 1 to 4 hours. And these interviews were very in-depth. They didn't just talk about autism or research participation or risk. They actually contextualized people's understandings in their lived experiences of family, work, pregnancy, parenting, and the forms of services that they had for their child that was already diagnosed on the autism spectrum. Now, importantly, these women were going through or had just gone through another pregnancy, so they were a population that would be encompassed under this sort of high-risk family. And 3 key themes emerged from these interviews that I think point to really important ways that we can think about risk research in the context of some of the talks that we heard yesterday about service providing and acceptance of autism more broadly. And these are environmental risks and responsibility, decisions during pregnancy, and the importance of support. So one mother told me that, in her opinion, there are strong environmental factors that went into my first daughter developing autism. And I feel like genetics were a lower portion. And that genetic portion, you can't control that. And here I want to point to this last line, not to evaluate the value of her perception about the causes of autism, but in fact to see how her perception shaped her sense of control. So she felt that genetics were not something she could control, but in fact environmental factors were. However, this sense of control had a sort of dark underbelly where it implicated women in my study in having many more responsibilities that they hadn't anticipated before thinking about environmental risks for autism. So this mother said, I suddenly felt like it was my responsibility to ensure certain things, whereas before that wasn't my responsibility because I didn't realize anyone needed to be responsible for it. This sense of responsibility or control circulating around environmental factors really influenced individuals' decisions during pregnancy. And this was based on their sort of embodied experiences, how they experienced the pregnancy that they had had previously and the one they were having now. One mother said, my daughters are very similar. So right from the beginning of my second pregnancy, I was like, I've been here before. So this kind of anticipation that is really provoked by the kind of cultural messages we send about being aware of multiple risks at all times. And also ambivalence, right? So another mother told me, with my first son, I cut out all of the caffeine during my pregnancy, all of it. My second, I was less strict. I was like, if I did all that before and my older son still has autism, so if I dye my hair and get a pedicure and have a latte, chances are my baby might have autism or he might not. So pregnancy-wise, I was not as picky with the care. And here you see this kind of ambivalence, but also an acceptance that we can't possibly control development, and to anticipate every possible risk may produce anxieties and stresses and responsibilities that are really detrimental in other ways. So I want to turn finally to the importance of support. So in the sea of uncertainties and the complex navigation of services that we've seen in this diagnostic odyssey related to autism, individuals really emphasized the importance of support. So one woman said, everybody says it's just this huge spectrum and you just never know what the prognosis is going to be, speaking of autism more broadly. And another said, we don't have answers yet. We can't be black or white. So I kind of had to be in the middle, and this kind of obligation to really weigh all of the evidence and weigh the experiences that she's having over time. And finally, I don't know what it's going to be like, an autism spectrum disorder diagnosis for her child, or what it's going to look like, but it's helpful to have people who are experiencing the same things. So what I want to turn to is really this final moment about implications for ethical considerations related to environmental risk research specifically, but also really speaking to the larger culture within which we've emphasized etiologic understandings maybe over, or definitely over, lifespan issues and recognition of the developmental trajectories that take place. So knowledge of environmental factors may provide a sense of control, but it also implicates individuals, and especially mothers going through a second pregnancy after diagnosis of a child with autism, with an increased sense of responsibility. There's perceptions of risk that depend on personal context, and there's this sense that the implications for families are deep and broad, and it also has, it resonates with our conversations about autistic acceptance more broadly, and can lead to risk factor fatigue. So in conclusion, I want to point out that information about autism is often incomplete. By a very definition, risk information is partial, and few cases are going to have a cause, and that in fact, what may be more personally meaningful and professionally advantageous is to think about the impacts that the narratives that we share about environmental factors have, including feelings of blame and responsibility, especially around pregnancy, and how for many of the individuals that I interviewed, their sense of the meanings of risk and the importance of that kind of information faded over time. So as these families secured support and services and found a more supportive environment within which to raise their children on the autism spectrum, questions about the causes of autism mattered very little in relationship to these broader lifespan issues. And so I'll leave you with that, and I look forward to your questions during the panel.